Hi, everyone. This is Sam Gruber for CSP. Welcome back. We're going to take another journey to one of my favorite Jewish buildings or places or spaces. This time we're off to Krakow, Poland. Krakow is one of the most beautiful cities in Central Europe. And remarkably, because of the vicissitudes of history, most of the physical aspects of the Jewish quarter were preserved. Of course, horrible things happened in the Holocaust to the Jewish population, which is important to remember as we walk through these buildings that still survive. But if you go to Krakow now, you'll see the old Jewish quarter of Kazimierz revived with a taste of the Jewish past, interpreted in 21st century garb, but also the space is filled with new types of activity and filled with young people. It's a very different place. Still within this area, a number of important synagogues survive. And today we're going to take a deep dive into the Tempel Synagogue, the Postępowa Synagogue or Progressive Synagogue, which was the last of the synagogues to be built. And it's the biggest and most ornate of all the synagogues of the city. So without further ado, come with me and take a look at the Tempel Synagogue on Miodowa Street in Krakow. And I think you'll be impressed by what you see. The Tempel Synagogue is certainly a favorite place of mine, in part because of its art and architecture and its history, but also because of my own personal association with the building. When I first got involved in the documentation and preservation of Jewish places in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Tempel Synagogue was one of the first that came to my attention as a building in desperate need of attention. After the fall of communism and the opening up of Poland in 1989, 1990, I visited Poland with friends and mentors, Maria and Maciej Piechota, the great scholars of Polish synagogue art and architecture. And they took me to the Tempel Synagogue and, of course, lamented its current state. It was one of the best preserved physically of all the synagogues in Poland, because there had been hundreds and hundreds, thousands, in fact, in Poland that had been destroyed during the war. But it was in terrible condition. Nominally, it still functioned as a house of worship, and the tiny Jewish community of Krakow held a service there once a year in order to keep title to the building. But it was sadly neglected. The building had been the pride of the Reform congregation, the intellectuals, the musicians, artists, doctors, industrialists who were modernizing Judaism in Krakow in the 19th century. It was their pride and joy, and it continued to be a beautiful building really up until the Nazi invasion in 1939. But afterward, the Germans used it as a stable. They didn't tear down the building. All of Krakow was preserved because it was a German command center. So unlike Warsaw, which was devastated, destroyed during the war, Krakow survived. But they debased the building, and its beauty was effaced. When the few surviving Jews of Krakow came back after the war, all of their houses of worship had essentially been devastated. And the Tempel Synagogue was the first that they reclaimed as a place for congregation. It had been the Reform synagogue, but it became basically the catch-all synagogue for everyone. But the ones who came back and stayed were mostly trained in an Orthodox tradition. So as we'll see, they made some revisions to the interior. But still, the building was in sad repair and continued to be neglected for the next decades. So in 1990, when I first visited, it was dilapidated, the plaster falling off the exterior walls, the interior decoration totally discolored. But gradually in the 1990s, a program came together, a team came together, sponsored by the World Monuments Fund and aided by the Monuments Committee in Krakow to restore this great building. So we're going to look mostly at the building as it looks today, but I'll throw in a few other older photographs. This is an older photograph that just shows it in its final state. The building went through many phases, as I say, this is from 1893, 95, 1905 mostly, but the first part of the building, a core, which we'll take a look at, was already built in 1860, 62, and then the last phases were introduced to the building really just a short time before the German invasion. So there was innovation and change in the building as late as 1937. You can see it's a grand building. It's a big building. In architectural terms, we would call it very eclectic. It's hard to assign a particular style to it. It has elements of Romanesque, what we call corbel tables. That would be these little arches around the edges, the roof line. It has sort of Moorish residual elements, these little turrets here, and some of the decoration as well, but particularly what we'll see on the inside. It has Gothic elements like these quatrefoil little clover leaf decorations along this horizontal band. And then it also has rounded windows, which could be Romanesque, medieval, but they also recall Renaissance and post-Renaissance architecture. So it's very much what we call an eclectic work of the 19th century, which was the great age of historicism, where everybody was in architecture schools and they were looking at buildings all over Europe and grabbing this piece or that piece as inspiration and putting them all together, sort of a collage of architecture. But they were also using handbooks of architecture. So even buildings they couldn't personally visit, they could get designs from. And this is very much a result of that. Is it a great work of architecture? No, probably not. But it is a great work, surviving work of synagogue architecture in Poland and all of Central Europe, because so many other contemporary buildings were destroyed. So it has its own qualities, which we'll see in art and architecture, but particularly because of its historical role in the 19th and 20th century for Polish Jewry. But it also stands as a surrogate. It's for all of those buildings that have been lost. So we're going to visit inside in just a minute, but I want to give you some little comparative history to show you where it is, both in place and time. So we have not really, in these investigations, delved deep into the 19th century, the age of what's often called cathedral synagogues. I mentioned it briefly in our talk, actually, about the modern North Shore Congregation Israel in America. But in the mid-19th century, because of changes in laws, which essentially gave Jews many more freedoms, Jews were allowed to build bigger buildings in more prominent places. But it was also a responsibility, almost a requirement that was put upon them by governing authorities, saying, if you're going to get these freedoms, you must create a kind of civic architecture. And the civic architecture had to be grand to compete with libraries and town halls and also churches, but also not to be confused with those buildings. So one of the innovations, and we'll come back to this, I'm sure, in another episode of our travels, one of the innovations of the mid-19th century was when Christian architects applied to Jewish projects a kind of composite style, which was essentially invented in the mid-19th century, even going back to the 1830s, which we now call Moorish. They called it Oriental, they called it Mauritanian. There were many names at the time, but collectively we generally call this Moorish today. And the inspiration comes generally from Spanish architecture from the Middle Ages, particularly what's known at the Alhambra in Granada, but there are many other sources too, from Egypt and from the Middle East, that are put together as a kind of mix, almost a hodgepodge. But very, very visually stimulating, sometimes overwrought, and so a lot of people don't like it because it's so decorative. There's no surface that goes untreated. Think how different modernism is from this. But a lot of people delight in this. And I think in recent years, since the 1990s, in fact, when there's been a rediscovery of this style and restoration of a lot of these older buildings, there's been a particular affection for this type of decoration, particularly because of the quality, the amount of time and effort and creativity that went into the work. We appreciate that level of workmanship today when we live in a era of prefab parts, which seem to have receive so little human touch. So the two big buildings that influenced the development of this style the most were built in Vienna and Budapest. This was, these were the capitals of the Habsburg Empire, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so big buildings were built, and the one on the left no longer survives. That's the Tempel Synagogue in Vienna, and then on the right, the Dohány Synagogue in Budapest, which is there, and I think we'll probably make a visit to at some point if in the future. It's one of the best known, it's the biggest synagogues in Europe. And since the early 1990s, it's been restored and a very active place for both worshipers and for visitors. Some of this Moorish style you'll see comes into play in the Tempel Synagogue. This is the interior of the Dohány Synagogue, and you can see the size. It's essentially arranged in a traditional, almost ancient, or we now think of it as a church-like arrangement of a basilica, essentially a big rectangular space that's divided by a central aisle, and then you have side aisles on to the left and right, supported in the Jewish instances usually with a gallery. In the Dohány case, 2 galleries above it, and then there's a focus on a big central point, which is the Ark, the Aron HaKodesh, which is the focal point of the ceremonies in these places. You'll see in the Dohány there isn't a big central bema or a reader's place for the Torah, and that's indicative of changes in 19th century worship in the Reform movement, or in this case of Hungary, what's called the status quo. And the space becomes much more theatrical, and the arrangement between the performing, we would think we now call them clergy, really. It's not just a teacher, the rabbi is a teacher, it's the rabbi and the cantor and the choir as performers. It becomes much more theatrical, and they're up in the front, almost on a stage-like area, and then the congregation is more of an audience in behind. So this is going to be very common throughout Europe in the 19th century and in the United States. And the Tempel Synagogue is similar to that. A more or less contemporary example in Poland is originally Germany, was in Gliwice, which no longer survives. But I show you this because we get an interior shot, and you'll see that there are, again, similarities to what we're going to see in the Tempel Synagogue there. So there were scores of these big buildings, I would say hundreds. Germany had them in almost every city, and most were destroyed in the Holocaust. But in the Czech Republic, there's still some. In Slovakia, in Hungary, there are more. But in Poland, the Tempel Synagogue is one of the few, and certainly the biggest and best preserved of the lot that comes down to us. So here it is. This is what it looked like when I first encountered it. I didn't take this picture. We were lucky somebody had an aerial view, but you can see it was still standing intact, but it looked kind of sad. It needed a new roof. It needed reinforcing the walls. There was water penetration. The interior plaster was deteriorated, and it was in sad shape. But it was still the central point, really, of entry into the old Jewish quarter of Kazimierz from the old city of Krakow. And it was, it's right here, number 4. And here's a detail. It occupies this major intersection of two streets. And these are intersections that were opened up to join Kazimierz and Krakow after the Jews were granted a freer existence. And in 1848, really the whole restrictions against Jews were essentially lifted, and the old Jewish quarter, which goes back to the late Middle Ages, this town here known as Kazimierz, and these are all still surviving synagogues or other Jewish sites, was more tied in to the downtown. And very soon you would have streetcars linking the two and major roads. And today you'll see tourists strolling up and down the main streets across this big boulevard to the historic sites, which are mostly Christian on one side and then Jewish on the other. Here you see again, and in this longer view, you see how commanding the building is on this site. And the building predates by a bit, but not too much, these buildings on the side. So when it was first built, it would have been even more impressive. But in the late 19th to early 20th century, you begin getting these bigger apartment buildings on these new streets. Just a detail again coming in closer. And here I want you to see that it's really built of several parts. The core, which is the sanctuary, is this central area. It's 2 stories, and you can see this row of double windows, what we call bifora windows, B-I-F-O-R-A, which people say, oh, they look like the tablets of the law, and they do, but it's also just a standard Romanesque way of creating small windows in thick walls. And then you have a front wing that projects here, and this was totally reworked. So the central core dates from the 1860s, and then this was reworked in the 1890s. So the facade is from the 1890s, and then the east end where the ark was also pushed out, and there's a whole new arrangement in the back. And then in the 1920s, because the congregation was getting bigger and bigger, side aisles were added on either side, and this is one of them. So they're pushing out from the wall. Originally, there were some outbuildings in the back, which were still there in the 1990s. Those were later torn down and replaced by the new Jewish Community Center, which occupies this space. It's called the Prince of Wales Jewish Community Center because King Charles was the patron and helped raise the money for it. So this is what it looks like from the Ark area. So all of this is going to be from the 1890s. And then we get a little sign, one of many, which now mark the Jewish sites through Kazimierz, right on the building. Here's the new Jewish Community Center and a little sign, Prince of Wales Jewish Community Center, and those other people who donated to it. If you go to Krakow, definitely stop at the JCC because it is the liveliest Jewish space. And Jonathan Ornstein, who runs it, is a dynamic and terrific leader of a very unusual community because there's an old community in Krakow, which I know very well because I worked with them very closely in the 1990s. And then there's a new Jewish community, which are new arrivals and transients from America, from Germany, from Israel, and then Poles who've rediscovered their Judaism or their Jewish roots and have either formally converted to Judaism or at least participate actively in Jewish activities. So there's a school there. It's a lively place, but whether every Jew would find it halakhically Jewish, that's up for debate. But the spirit of it is fully Jewish, and it keeps not just the Jewish memory but Jewish practice alive in the city. So the Tempel Synagogue is on the edge of the old city. It was just this area that was cleared, so a new boulevard, and that opened up building lots, and that allowed the synagogue to be built. But on the other side is Kazimierz, the old Jewish quarter where Jews were allowed to live from medieval times, and they created their own city within the city here. The main artery is a kind of square, but it's called a street, Shoroka Street, and this is a view from one end. And what we're looking at is a little area that was probably a medieval Jewish cemetery. There's now a little Holocaust memorial there. And then at the far end is the old synagogue, the Starry Synagogue, which goes back to the 15th century. And then there are other sites along the way. On the right here is the Reb Mu Synagogue, which is the revered center of Krakow's Orthodoxy. So the starry here on the left and the Rebbe on the right. So this is the old Judaism, the Orthodox Judaism. When the Temple Synagogue was built, that old Jewish community, especially the Hasidic community, which in fact was not that old because they had been revolutionaries, or they had been ostracized revolutionaries, they'd been heretics almost in Judaism only about 50 years before, but they reacted vehemently against the erection of the Reform Synagogue, which was a result of the Jewish Enlightenment, we call the Haskalah. And there are rumors, I mean, there are stories about Jews who would cross the street, Orthodox Jews who wouldn't come near this building, they would walk all the way around it, or they would spit when they went in front of it. They were very offended by the notion of what was called Reform Judaism. Today, it's very close to what we would call modern Orthodoxy. And they were also offended by some of the aspirations of the Reform Jews in building this building and calling it a temple. Because today we routinely use, in English anyway, the word temple almost synonymously with synagogue, but at the time it was an act of, it was an ideological statement to say temple, because it meant that you essentially weren't waiting for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. You could have a permanent home and a primary place of worship in the here and now in the place you are by building a temple of your own. This is a movement that began in 1810 with Isaac Jacobson in Sessen, Germany, and then it spread east throughout the 19th century. So here you see it before the restoration. I took this picture in, I think, 1990, and this is after the restoration. This is actually taken from Wikipedia, and it's a fairly recent view. A couple things in the facade I want you to notice. There's a tablet up here, tablets of the law, the Decalogue. Significantly, it's written in Hebrew. It's on the from right to left, and it includes the first words of the commandments. So it's not the abbreviated numbers, just 1, 2, 3, often in Roman numerals, that you'll see in other Reform and later Reform temples. In Prague, there's some examples of this. Also, there's this little plaque over the door, and this is a plaque that particularly offended the Orthodox. And I think I have a detail of it here. Let's take a look. I'll give you the translation. It says the year of the foundation of the house of God were laid in the month of the year 1862. The house was completed according to all of its details and all of its specifications. In English, it sounds very mild, but what it's actually doing is quoting directly from the description in the Book of Kings about the building of the Temple of Solomon. And for many of the Hasidim, this was over the top. This was comparing the building or to the temple too specifically. I mean, actually, this had been done many times before. If you look at the synagogue in Worms, Germany, which is a medieval synagogue, you have similar inscriptions around the capitals of the columns on the inside. And no one would ever suggest that congregation in 13th century Worms was a Reformed congregation. But in the politics of Krakow at the time, the rise of prestige of the Reform movement and of wealth and power just upset the older Hasidic leaders, and so caused this conflict. The irony, which we'll see, is that now Hasidic groups go and routinely use the Temple Synagogue when they come to Krakow. So things change over time. And then over the gates here, enter his gates with praise, his courts with acclamation. That's from Psalms. It's also taken to imply going into the temple, so that too has that association. So here's a plan of the building, and it's very simple. So generally we would call it a basilical form because it has 3 aisles, a central aisle here, and then side aisles, and there are going to be galleries above here. And then, as I said, in the 1920s, there were extensions off to the side. There are 2 stair towers in the front, a little foyer here. One comes in and enters not so much a central aisle, but a central space. And this central space is residual from the original 1860s building, which you can imagine more or less as a square. And the square plan mostly derives from the traditional, a very common Polish plan for synagogues that we call the 9-bay plan. And it's only later blown out in the 1890s to make it longer and look at more like one of these 19th century basilicas that sometimes are also called cathedral synagogues. You'll see there's a big bema right in front of the ark. They're connected here. And this is all the result of rebuilding in the 1890s. Now, when I first came to the building, I have photos. I think they're slides. I wish I could find them. They may be with the World Monuments Fund, but we documented the whole building. And mostly it looked like this. This is actually a pretty good spot in the ceiling. You can see the plaster was falling, and so that was filled up with just a piece of cardboard there. But throughout the building, there was major damage to all of the wall surfaces. And just keep in mind the degradation of the colors, the gilding, and all of this decoration, because this is work that will be cleaned and then partially restored. Here, there's actual loss because of water damage, but in much of the interior, the loss, it was not a loss because of destruction, but of chemical reaction to actually to the urine of the horses that peed in this stable when for many years when the Germans used it for that purpose. And the ammonia caused a blackening of the gilding, of the silver and gold gilding. So all of what you're seeing here, this restore cleaning, was black when we went to the synagogue in 1990. The philosophy that we adopted, and this was with this man, Janusz Szmolski, who was the point man for the restoration in Krakow, working with the World Monuments Fund in New York. The philosophy we adopted was not to repaint, not to make the building look new, but to clean it and conserve as much as we could, 100% if we could, of the original fabric and materials, the original workmanship, and to show the vicissitudes of history on the building, because we felt that the devastation of the building during the Holocaust was an important part of its story. And to erase this by repainting, by making it look as it did in the 1890s, would be basically a violation of memory. This is something we tried to teach, and I was a very active proponent of this particular philosophy in the 1990s and through, but not everybody listened to me, and many buildings were consequently really just made given brilliant colors and just repainted and made new again. Sometimes that can be acceptable. I mean, this is what happened at the Doheny Synagogue in Budapest. And everything just looked too bright and shiny and new. Ironically, that was almost 30 years ago. I was there just last summer, and even the Doheny now, after 30 years, is beginning to look aged. So some of that shine has worn off, and it's beginning to feel more lived in, and I can like it more than I did way back then. So working with the Poles was very interesting, because we were trying to convince them about the need for restoring a synagogue, which was new to them, because synagogues were ignored during communism, except for one or two instances. And we were also talking about preserving a late 19th century building, which for them was also new. They have old stuff, medieval stuff. They have Renaissance buildings. They had thousands of buildings that needed restoration. 19th century was like yesterday to them. It wasn't even considered history. There had been a teaching during the communist period that sort of relegated the 19th century as a kind of bourgeois and capitalist period, and therefore not really worthy of much historical veneration or consideration even. Jewish history was similarly ignored. So to say we now want to look at Jewish history and 19th century history was a shock. And this was also a long educational process, which still continues today, but I think is mostly resolved because the whole world of recognition what is legitimate history, what is national history, what is what is material culture worth saving. That has changed in these decades. So this is just a piece that we wrote for the World Monuments Fund about, I guess this is about 25 years ago. So we see this detail of cleaning. This is a plaque on the left of donors for the 1893-1894 restoration or renovation, and that's still there, that survived. And then this is a more recent plaque about the World Monuments Fund work we began it actually in 1992, but the real work began in 94 and was carried out for about 6 years. It was very hard to raise money for that project. Today, the budget seems so cheap compared with construction costs, but raising that money, $100,000 back in the 1990s, nobody wanted, no Jews, no Americans wanted to give for anything in Poland. The memory of the experience, the interwar and the war experience in Poland was too great. So we got a lot of money we got money from the Getty, we got money from other international organizations, and eventually a number of Jewish donors came forward. And now, of course, no Jew goes to Krakow without stopping at the Tempel Synagogue, and it is the centerpiece for activities during the Jewish Cultural Festival, so much so that has damaged the building, and recently it's undergoing a new restoration. So just some drawings, and you get, again, to see the plan of the space that we looked at. So here's the interior, and you can see this is post-restoration. It's very beautifully colored, but it's actually maybe a little more muted than it might have been when it first reopened in the 1890s. The decoration is a mix, again, as I said, of medieval, Renaissance, Romanesque, and Gothic, and some Moorish decoration. The construction is really quite simple. These are wooden columns, and the walls are just simply brick. The original building from the 1860s was very modest and built inexpensively, although it had some nice plaster decoration. This has actually proven to be a problem in recent years. We did not, we restored the building as close to the original as possible. So we didn't put in steel reinforcement beams and that sort of thing. We didn't anticipate the building would ever need them. It's not really in an earthquake zone, but it's become so popular. They've had so many concerts here. It's become a big venue for klezmer concerts, as well as religious services. And young people crowd the balconies. And when the klezmer bands start playing, they start jumping up and down, jumping up and down. And this has created terrible destabilization of the building. And now, the walls have had to be reinforced. And you'll see in more recent pictures, there are actually places you can see where reinforcement bars have been put in, and not all of the repainting has been done since those interventions. And there are now signs in the synagogue that say, do not jump on the balconies, but I don't think it really stops that many people. There was more here. If you remember from the plan, there was actually more structure out here in the front that was lost in the Holocaust and not replaced. And instead, when the community came back, they built just a very simple wooden central bema, very crude, and these very simple and rather uncomfortable benches, which were put there as well. It was our decision when we did the restoration that these should stay. There were people who wanted to recreate the 19th century appearance, and we were very insistent, and the Jewish community, Cheshire Yakubovitz was the head of the community then, and others were very supportive in this, that this post-war history, this is where what was left of the Jewish community basically reconstituted itself, be remembered with this furniture. It also has had the added advantage that the building is kind of, can I say, kosher for Orthodox groups. They will come here and worship. The Ramu is too small, it's tiny, and not everyone can't be used all the time. But bigger groups come here and they will use this synagogue, and that central bema serves the purposes. So here are some details post-restoration. I think these are from 2008. I've been back to the building many times, and so these photos are from different eras. I want you to take a look. We're going to take a detail of the decoration of the big arch, what we call a triumphal arch, over this projecting apse. On the outside, it looks like an apse of a church, but on the inside, it really doesn't look that way. It just creates an arc wall, but it provides some depth behind for movement. And there's also depth in the part of the Aron for the actual storage of the Torah scrolls. It gives some space back there. But in the 19th century style, and we saw that at the Doheny synagogue, and it existed in many, many synagogues across Europe, the ark almost becomes a piece of architecture itself, so a building within the building. This is not entirely unique. I don't have an image to show you, but maybe at another time, if you look at 14th century illustrations in Spanish Haggadot, you'll see some of the synagogues also had essentially buildings within buildings. The arks were structures. They were little houses within the synagogue. So here's some details. This one is from 2018. So I want you to take a good look at the ceiling. This is a prime example of what we call the Moorish style of decoration. Also, the stars in the half apse over the ark are interesting because this is a traditional Jewish decorative motif. We find in churches too. There's a lot of cross influence, but even in medieval illuminations of synagogues, we don't have the buildings. We don't have any decoration surviving from it, even the few medieval synagogues that we still know. But in manuscript illuminations, we can see that the ceilings were often decorated with stars. And of course, that represents the heavens, so it's quite understandable. But here we have this ornate decoration in the ceiling, and we'll have some more. This is the over the ark. This is before restoration, and you can see how blackened the lions and the Decalogue and the crown are, and there's cracks in the walls. And then this is what it looks like now with the telephoto lens, and you can see the color that's been restored or cleaned. I want to get up to the ceiling. I just couldn't stop. I can never stop taking pictures when I go to this building because it's really quite stunning. So here's the ceiling, and you can see this was all black almost. This was not repainted, it was retouched, but it was mostly cleaned. And then a very light regilding on some of the border areas to bring back that gold, because the gilding was very important in an era before electric lighting. When light is limited, you need to have a lot of shiny stuff in the decoration because it picks up and reflects the candlelight, and then later this was gaslit, and then it was electrified at a later date. So that's true for all old buildings. Think of that when you go to an old building and you see a lot of gold, or a gold in a medieval altarpiece, a Christian altarpiece. Why is there so much gold? Well, it's a form of light. It's the way we put like a piece of tin behind on a sconce just to reflect the light out, because the light was precious. Light was precious, and it was limited. And while this is a reasonably well lit building from natural light because of the windows aren't big because this is not a steel reinforced building like a modern building. It's masonry, so you can't make the windows too big or the weight of the roof will crush the walls. But this type of decoration becomes quintessentially Jewish in the 19th century as part of the Moorish style, but its origins go back to Moorish, that is Muslim decoration in Spain, North Africa, that's rediscovered in the 19th century by travelers. Some of you may know Washington Irving's book, Tales of the Alhambra. That was very popular. And then the British artist Owen Jones goes and creates designs based on the Alhambra decorations. He does designs based on many other cultures around the world too. But his famous book, which is a big portfolio book, has big plates. The Grammar of Ornament becomes the decorative Bible for designers in the 19th and well into the 20th century. So the types of decorations that he's printing in the 1850s very quickly make their way into those Moorish buildings of the mid-century. And there are a few other sources too, but Owen Jones is the most prominent. And certainly by the 1890s, it's a go-to source. And my colleague and great friend, Eleonora Bergman, the architectural historian in Warsaw, has written a whole book about sort of the Moorish style in Poland. And there were many examples of this. But again, Krakow is really the only one that survives intact. This is the Dohany on the right, just to give you an idea. And these are original designs, but it's all been repainted. So these are a few details of the ceiling. And this type of decoration you'll find in America, Central Synagogue, Plum Street Synagogue in Cincinnati. So these mid-century America was also in the same, in following the same trend. So it's really quite beautiful. Now we're up in the women's gallery. Women's gallery, you say, in a Reform synagogue? Yes, because as I said, Reform in the 19th century means something very different from what it means today. Reform in Europe was something very different from Reform in America. So the service at the Tempel Synagogue in the 19th century would have been the same service. The liturgy would be the same as in an Orthodox, a traditional Mitnagim, Ashkenazi's congregation, even very essentially the same as the Hasidic service, although they used a different minchag, the Sephardic minchag. But there was much more propriety, decorum. People dressed up. They wore top hats. There was separation of men and women, but the separation was not as severe as in some of the earlier synagogues, and the service was in Hebrew, but it would just be interrupted by a sermon, which was a new introduction to Judaism, a sermon by the rabbi, who now was not just a teacher and a judge who might give a sermon twice a year, but would be weekly addressing the congregation. It would be a sermon in this case, in Polish, but in other places, it would be in Yiddish. But here it would be Polish, the native language, and in Germany it would be in German, and which indicates that the people who were attending this were not assimilated. They were active Jews, but they were acculturated. They were comfortable in Polish society as well. They had Polish general educations as well as Jewish educations, and they spoke Polish probably in their professional lives. So here we are up in the women's gallery looking down towards the entrance. We get a better view of the decoration up here. And then this is one of the side aisles. This is a side aisle where the decoration has been restored. This is all repainting. And when I visited this in 1990, all these paint walls were just red, and we didn't know what the decoration was. And then just by accident, we looked all over for a photo. We couldn't find a single photo for a year or two. We couldn't find a single photo of what the building looked like inside before the Holocaust. And then one day when I was killing time in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, waiting for an appointment actually with my friend Lena, I was just looking through boxes of photos in the archive, and they were all foldered with each place. So I said, oh, here's from this place and that place and that place. But I was looking through a folder, and then I pulled out a photo and I said, wait a minute. This is misidentified. This is actually the Temple Synagogue. So that photo allowed us to, using computer enhancement, to get some idea of what the decoration looked like, not originally, but from the 1930s. I think the photo was from the 1930s. And so that allowed some recreation in addition to all of the cleaning. These are these simple wooden columns, and then they were decorated, painted. Now, one of the splendid parts of the synagogue is also the stained glass windows, and these are from the 19th century, the 1890s, and then some from the 1920s. And these were already beautifully restored before our work at the World Monuments began. So these had been done just a few years before by the Polish conservators based in Krakow. So they had been aware of the value of the building. So just a few more details. And so part of this is the patina of ware was left there. Part of it is 30 years later, still more work is needed. And here's the stairs to the women's gallery, views from above. Some more indication of that recreated wall decoration. And we leave the building, and here it is in all of its glory today. So I think inevitably, if you go to Krakow, and you really should, most people know they should go to Prague and Krakow. These are the two great centers in Central Europe that preserve the physical remains of the Jewish past. They have small Jewish communities, but there's a lot of Jewish life. And Krakow is especially famous for the last more than 25 years for the Jewish Cultural Festival that happens every June, which offers something for everybody. So I urge a visit to Krakow and stop in the Tempel Synagogue. There are several others. It'll take you a few days to really see all of the Jewish sites in Krakow, including Holocaust memorial sites, which are very important. So schedule accordingly. Don't just pop in for a day. Go and spend some time there. Thank you for joining me for this visit to the Tempel Synagogue in Krakow. I think this one was a little longer, but I have such affection for this building and the community, and it means so much to me personally. I hope that the visit, the time spent was worth it. It's a beautiful place, and it's in a beautiful city, and I hope that you visit there soon.